In recent weeks, as you mentioned, the news has been all about our broken supply chains, with a special focus on the massive amount of ships stuck outside the port of Los Angeles.
This is what a broken supply chain looks like from the air. Nearly 60 cargo ships floating outside the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. They're carrying about 250,000 containers. The workers will soon be unloading around the clock. Truckers at the Port of LA sometimes have to line up for hours just to pick up one container. And then where do they take them? Most warehouses are full, and that's delaying deliveries even further.
The supply chains, folks, they're broken. They're very broken. Now, remember the early days of the pandemic when there was a mad dash to stockpile things like toilet paper? Well, it looks like the shortages could be coming back.
If you've been to the store lately, you may have been met with scenes like this. Empty shelves from the cereal aisle to deodorant and paper goods, everyday items in increasingly short supply.
But more importantly, perhaps the most important thing in the world, is that it looks like the supply chain backlog will affect the all-important Christmas shopping season, which so many retailers rely on.
We're going into Target now.
These are video diaries. It's a lot to do. From 4 shoppers across the country.
Here we go.
On a mission to buy.
I feel like stuff's running out everywhere I go.
Before COVID steals Christmas. Wish me luck.
My grandson wants something called Beyblade.
Karen Breen hasn't bought candy for Halloween yet. Or even thought about who's hosting Thanksgiving dinner. So what's on her mind?
I am on my way to start my Christmas shopping.
Yes, COVID is stealing Christmas, and we're all going to be getting a lump of coal in our stockings. But COVID-19 has shown us just how vulnerable our globalized economy is to shocks. Obviously, a once-in-a-century pandemic is something that comes around, well, once every 100 years. Although it is safe to say that our globalized economy probably does make pandemics more likely. But there have been other incidents that have shown just how fragile the system is. Like, hey, remember 6 months ago when that big old boat just got stuck in the Suez Canal?
A massive cargo ship spending a third day stuck in Egypt's Suez Canal, clogging one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. Rescue crews now say it might take weeks to set it free. Today, multiple tugboats failed to dislodge the Ever Given. Officials say strong winds and a sandstorm knocked the ship off course.
Man, because of the insane breakneck pace of the news cycle, it's hard to remember news that happened more than 2 weeks ago. But that was just 6 months ago, and it feels like forever. But reminiscing about that big old beautiful ship made me kind of happy. But anyway, the fragility of global supply chains is by design. Namely, it's the idea of just-in-time production. According to Kim Moody, writing in The Guardian, just-in-time was the idea of Taiichi Ohno, an engineer at Toyota in the 1950s who was inspired by the work of Henry Ford. Ohno defined it as a way of eliminating waste, which he meant stockpiles, extra workers, and unused minutes in the production and movement of goods. Instead of wasting time, labor, and money by storing parts along the assembly line or warehousing goods, as manufacturers had done for decades, Ohno's idea was that suppliers could instead deliver these just as they were needed. In turn, this would increase profits, reducing the amount that businesses spent on maintaining inventories and paying for additional labor. This type of manufacturing made Japanese cars more competitive on the international market. This made the previously dominant American auto manufacturers very, very nervous. In fact, you don't hear about it anymore, but back in the 70s and 80s, it was really common to see bumper stickers and the like urging people to, quote, buy American cars instead of Toyotas or Hondas, which were quickly taking market share from Ford and General Motors. Eventually, because competition is the name of the game in capitalism, American firms had to adopt just-in-time production as well. Here's Kim Moody again. After its introduction to the West in the 1980s, the just-in-time model gradually moved out of the car plant and into every type of goods and service production. It forced its way down every supply chain until each supplier, big or small, was expected to deliver products promptly to the next buyer. This increased competition between companies to deliver goods quickly, which meant firms reduced their costs, usually the price of labor. Just-in-time delivery thus contributed to the growth of low-wage, often more precarious jobs, with workers recruited only when they would be needed. This constant squeezing of workers has fueled our 24/7 hustle workflow culture and the mental health problems that go with it, which, while attempts to cut the price of labor, have added to the growth of economic inequality, regardless of who sits in government. But there are trade-offs for all this efficiency, not to mention, the fact that it kills jobs and destroys communities. It is that it reduces resiliency in the system. In general, as efficiency increases, resilience decreases. But because capitalist economies force companies to compete, they will always choose to maximize efficiency. Because while the system as a whole may need more resilience, the incentive for the individual firm is always going to be for more efficiency. It is one of the contradictions inherent in capitalism. But policymakers have also contributed to this, especially with so-called free trade agreements. Instead of acting as stay-at managers of the system, maybe introducing public policy to increase resilience, they have lubricated the mad rush towards efficiency through public policy. And perhaps the biggest offender of this was friend of the show and Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Clinton. Yes, Slick Willie, who just yesterday had to go to the hospital with a UTI, famously passed NAFTA in 1994. But perhaps less famously, but more consequentially, Bill Clinton, just before he left office, pushed for and managed to cut a trade deal with China, getting them into the World Trade Organization.
This agreement is a good deal for America. Our products will gain better access to China's market in every sector, from agriculture to telecommunications to automobiles. But China gains no new market access to the United States, nothing beyond what it already has.
Now, what's remarkable about that is that a majority of Democrats in the House actually voted against it. There were 73 Democrats who joined 164 Republicans to approve the deal. Bill Clinton just absolutely loved to do that. He loved to pass Republican policies in the face of Democratic opposition. But anyway, the deal was not just opposed by a majority of Democrats in the House. It was opposed by environmental groups and labor unions. Here is the labor-backed Economic Policy Institute writing about the deal back in the year 2000 when it happened. Quote, the administration has proposed to facilitate China's entry into the WTO at a time when the U.S. has already has a massive trade deficit with China. In 1999, the U.S. imported approximately $81 billion in goods from China and exported $13 billion, a 6-to-1 ratio of imports to exports that represents the most unbalanced relationship in the history of U.S. trade. While exports generated about 170,000 jobs in the United States in 1999, imports eliminated almost 1.1 million domestic job opportunities for a net loss of 880,000 high-wage manufacturing jobs. China's entry into the WTO under PNTR, which means Permanent Normal Trade Relations, with the U.S. will lock this relationship into place, setting the stage for rapidly rising trade deficits in the future that would severely depress employment in manufacturing, the sector most directly affected by trade. China's accession to the WTO would also increase income inequality in the U.S. Those criticisms were deemed absurd by the very serious people in Washington. The Washington Post editorial page and business leaders and other think tanks all supported the deal. But as Jordan Weissman writes in Slate, quote, in hindsight, the fears weren't absurd at all. In the months immediately after Congress voted to normalize trade with China, dozens of U.S. corporations announced that they were moving manufacturing overseas. And once China officially joined in the WTO in 2001, the country rapidly began transforming into an export behemoth as foreign investment and factory work flooded into the country. Its surplus with the United States alone rose from $83 billion in 2001 to more than $295 billion in 2011. During the same 10-year period, U.S. manufacturing employment, which had stayed essentially steady in the years after NAFTA, declined from about 17.1 million to 11.8 million. Manufacturing had been withering as a share of America's labor market for many, many years, but the shockingly fast collapse of the early 2000s simply convulsed blue-collar communities. The outsourcing of jobs destroyed untold communities in the U.S. It also made capitalists very rich, but it also made our supply chains longer and more vulnerable to shocks. The Chinese, meanwhile, were much more judicious in their own development. Chinese policymakers are not free market fundamentalists and often implement much more protectionist policies to spur their own capacities. Here's Ho Feng Hung writing in Jacobin. Quote, after China got what it wanted in terms of U.S. policy, China changed its policy to make sure foreign companies like AT&T could not have majority stakes in leadership in China's telecommunications sector. And Beijing started to cultivate its state-owned telecommunication giants like China Mobile and China Telecom to dominate the market and marginalize foreign countries. The situation became much more apparent in 2010 and thereafter. In fact, just this week, China essentially shut down LinkedIn, the last American social media platform that was able to operate in the country. No more joining my professional network on LinkedIn in China. So the U.S. normalized trade relations with China. In theory, this was going to give American firms access to the vast Chinese market. What actually happened was that American firms outsized their productive operations to China because the labor costs were cheaper. But the Chinese regulated their market to limit the ability of American firms like, say, social media platforms to get access to the Chinese market. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not passing judgment on the Chinese for doing this. It is, in fact, a rational policy from their perspective. But American policymakers are constantly complaining about China's dastardly cheating in the fair game that is the free market. And increasingly, they are starting to realize that a laissez-faire approach cannot compete with an approach driven by state planning. Remember, it was Bill Clinton that led this charge in the 1990s. These days, his wife, Hillary Clinton, sings a very different tune.
Increasingly, the Chinese government, through coercion, through unfair regulation, through enforced partnerships or royalty agreements, is slowly stealing that intellectual property anyway. So I do think that we've got to get smarter about how we deal with the economic threat. And for people who say, oh, well, you know, that disrupts the market. China has disrupted the market. China is not a free market economy. We tried. We let them into the World Trade Organization. We sent our businesses over there. We made trade deals. They are a controlled top-down economy. You will never compete and win against them unless you take back the means of production. And it is way past due for us trying to do that. And I know that, the Biden administration is very keen on trying to reestablish our own supply chains, but we should do it in concert.
So what to make of all of this? Like I said, one of the inherent contradictions of capitalism is that companies need to compete to make the system on the whole. The companies need to compete makes the system on the whole more vulnerable. That drive for competition makes capitalists find efficiencies to reduce labor costs, whether it is just-in-time production or robots that do the work of humans. But according to Marx, it is labor that creates profits, because unlike machines, humans can produce in excess of what they are paid. A machine just produces what it produces. But individual capitalists are incentivized to reduce labor costs through technology or more efficient manufacturing process to get a short-term advantage over his competitor. But eventually, the other capitalists realize this and catch up, causing the rate of profit to fall over time. And indeed, the rate of profit has been falling pretty steadily since World War II. Now, when the rate of profit goes down, well, capitalism enters into a crisis. And as you can see from the chart, the 1970s saw a major crisis in profitability, which is what led capitalists and the system they controlled to institute neoliberalism, which kind of stabilized the bleeding when it came to profits for a little while. But then it all came crashing down again in 2008. The rate of profit rebounded somewhat after that, but now it is going down again and will likely continue to go down because, well, that's what it does over time. It's inevitable. So the question will become, how does the system respond? Well, there could be more just straight coercion and authoritarianism. That's certainly in the cards. But the weakness of the system also presents opportunities. Hey, remember that big old boat that paralyzed global trade by just getting her big old butt stuck in the Suez Canal? Well, workers have the power to do that as well. The lack of resilience in these hyper-efficient supply chains means that a comparatively small number of workers can exert tremendous power. I spoke last week about how just 60,000 IATSE members could stop literally the entire entertainment industry overnight, causing a multi-billion-dollar industry to just shut down. And this is true all across the supply chain. And that is why this mini little strike wave we're seeing is so encouraging. In the past few years, labor militancy has been driven largely by teacher strikes, which are disruptive, don't get me wrong, but much more manageable than a strike that affected the supply chain. As we enter Striketober, with hundreds of thousands of workers taking action, it is the perfect time to hit at the system when it is most vulnerable. We must do whatever we can to encourage this kind of worker militancy. Yes, you may get frustrated when you can't get your treats for Christmas, but think of the big picture. If there is no resurgent and powerful labor movement, then the capitalists will have free rein to reset the system to deal with the crisis of profitability. And if you thought neoliberalism 1.0 was bad, the sequel will likely be much nastier.
That was great. Really good, comprehensive explanation of what's going on with the right lens. There's also the other side of it that I think is at least worth mentioning. The inflation that we're experiencing right now is obviously hurting a lot of people lower on the socioeconomic ladder. And so while it's like incredibly encouraging to see labor flex its power because they have leverage right now, there's the other side of it as well. Like there's a lot of sacrifice going on because especially when it comes to strikes, you're risking a lot to do that strike. And disrupting supply chains also does mean inflation, so increase in the cost of goods and services that people need. But I do think that this is a really, really important opportunity to use leverage that workers know that they have. And I'm really happy to see it, not just in regard to organized labor and those represented by unions, but also by individual workers who don't have that kind of representation, who are like, no, I'm not going back to work. I'm looking for something different. Like you're seeing that across the board as well in various sectors. And it's forcing employers to increase wages to attract workers back. So
yeah. I mean, it's not a coincidence that in the 1970s, which was an era of high inflation, was also an era of there were strikes all the time. I mean, just all the time. It was like a fact of life. Because workers were getting squeezed by the high inflation. So there does seem to be a trend there, that it might be spurring the kind of current labor militancy to some degree. So yeah, I mean, it's just it's interesting to see and to think about in the near term, because they're going to do something to make the system flow again, they're going to do something. But the fact is, I don't know if you've seen in the UK, where they have this massive trucker shortage. And so they're having long lines at, gas pump, even though they have oil, they have gas. It's not like a gas shortage. It's a logistics problem due to trucker shortages. And it's what happens if they, if their choice is between just making it more attractive to become a truck driver, or just forcing people to drive trucks, I mean, that's kind of what the choices are going to be, is either they have to find some way to compel workers back. And, whether that's going to be more authoritarianism or just, improving conditions, is usually up to us, up to the left, up to the workers. That's kind of what the problem is. If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.